Chapter 8, Part 2. Mr. Gordon, driving his own coach and four, arrived at the Vendome the next morning. The day was bitter cold, and Sarah, swathed to her nose in several layers of fur, climbed up the coach ladder and, dramatically taking her place beside Mr. Gordon on the driver's seat, struck the proud attitude of the Russian princess she was eventually to play in Sardou's Fedora. Mr. Gordon cracked his whip, and his foursome made it in smart time to the dock where Henry Smith and a group of reporters were waiting. Beside them, coated in ice, the whale bobbed dolefully in the ripples of the Charles. Smith insisted that the wretched beast was still alive and that its rising and falling motion was the effect of its final gasps. Oh, that's so sad. After which melancholy announcement, he escorted Madame over a temporary gangplank leading onto the helpless captive's back, and with outstretched hand offered her the novel experience of walking on the back of a whale. To Sarah, the experience of novel seemed peculiarly uninviting. But she noted the increasing number of onlookers and, being a woman and never to turn down a challenge, she grabbed Smith's forearm and ventured out onto the mammal's dorsal surface, on which the two of them slipped, slid, and lurched for a number of merry moments. Then Smith made the appetizing suggestion that she pull out one of the creature's bones. Sarah, with ill-concealed aversion, reached down and drew forth a small, osseous sliver, which had obviously been planted in a freshly cut hole. God, this is gruesome. After which curious ceremony, she skidded back onto the dock and made a dash for sanctuary beside Mr. Gordon on the coach top. The gentleman driver cracked his whip, and the horses started off at a smart trot. The Bernhardt was in a state of boiling agitation, and Mr. Gordon, thinking she'd appreciate a means of letting off steam, offered to let her take the reins. Sarah, who had never taken the reins of so much as a Shetland pony, undauntedly seized the stout straps, with results that nearly ended in disaster. The four animals, sensing a new and inexperienced hand at the controls, broke from their smart trot into a wild gallop. The top-heavy vehicle careened around a corner at an angle that would have capsized a sailing vessel, and it was only Gordon's timely grabbing of the reins that prevented horses and coach from crashing through the plate glass windows of a florist's shop. Back in her hotel suite before a blazing fire, Madame B, with a sigh of relief, shed her voluminous furs. If she thought she had also shed the embarrassment of Smith and his wretched whale, she was to be brutally disenchanted. During the early 80s, the newspaper photographer may happily not have been in existence, but all American journals had their numbers of quick sketch artists who, at a moment's notice, could be dispatched to every corner of a city to cover the more unusual events of a day. That evening and the following morning, every paper in Boston and its environs carried a reproduced drawing of France's great actress savagely ripping a massive bone from the gashed side of a whale. That evening and the following morning, every paper in Boston and its environs carried a reproduced drawing of the great... I see, I just did that. The caption read, "How Sarah Bernhardt Gets the Whalebone for Her Corsets." As if the newspaper publicity were not sufficient offense, Henry Smith turned his pitiable behemoth into a sort of tent show, admission to which was 25 cents. He commandeered some jobless derelicts as sandwichmen to tramp the pavement bearing signs which read, "The phenomenon of France visits the phenomenon of the sea." And as further ballyhoo for his exhibit, he acquired a horse-drawn calliope, which blared through the streets, displaying a billboard in horrendous colors, again showing the actress in deboning act, and the caption, "Come see the gigantic whale killed by Sarah Bernhardt to furnish bones for her corsets, which are made exclusively by Madame Lily Noah of New York." How much Madame Lily Noah paid Mr. Henry Smith for the ad is not a matter of record. The fact that never in her life did Sarah Bernhardt wear a corset seems not to have concerned either of them. After Boston, the company played New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield, in each of which towns the first thing to greet the star's horrified eye and ear was Henry Smith's blaring calliope. By now, the billboard announced the added attraction that the giant cadaver was being kept in a state of perfect preservation by the daily administration into its stomach of 2 tons of salt at $100 per ton. At New Haven, Smith was waiting in the lobby of Madame Sarah's hotel, and upon her entrance bowed obsequiously. Madame's response to his greeting was in the form of a couple of violent and well-armed whacks on his beaming face. Smith, his face continuing to beam, bowed again, this time almost to the ground, muttered some words of gratitude, and a few minutes later sent up to her suite an immense bouquet of roses, which Madame, with a yowl of fury, hurled out of the nearest window. In Hartford, a similar bouquet met a similar fate. Here she vented her wrath by purchasing a couple of Colt revolvers. Sarah was an excellent shot, and in making the purchase, she was probably settling on Smith as the perfect target for her marksmanship. In Springfield, after she had again hurled another bouquet out of her window, she was taken to visit the Remington Firearms Factory, where she had the gratifying privilege of firing one of their cannons, doubtless imagining Smith as being tied to its mouth. In spite of its daily tons of salt, Smith's sideshow was becoming rather high, but in spite of the smell, it continued to attract the crowds, and the persistent promoter was making a fortune. What eventually held him up was the Canadian border, across which dead whales were not welcome. Henry Smith and his mammoth were left behind in upper New York State, while Sarah Bernhardt and her troop continued on to Montreal. They arrived in the pitch dark of a sub-zero pre-dawn, and were met not by any whale, but by what looked to be hundreds of bears, each carrying a lantern. This proved to be a vast delegation of officials and French-Canadian citizens wearing heavy fur coats and astrakhan hats. The flickering lantern lights played eerily on their ruddy faces and on the steaming breath that came from their cheering throats. The Montreal engagement was a huge success, due partly to some excellent publicity furnished by the Catholic Archbishop, who for several weeks had fulminated from his pulpit against the arrival in their pious city of this theatrical whore of Babylon. Time and again he had forbidden his flock to attend any of her performances, and, of course, the flock couldn't wait to attend every one of them. The particular play over which, as a contaminating influence, the holy man seems most to have worked himself up as scribe, and Legou's Adrien Lecouvreur, whose plot deals with the have worked himself up as scribe, and Legou's Adrien Lecouvreur, whose plot deals with the fatal rivalry between the actress Adrienne, an admitted courtesan, and the Duchesse de Bouillon, a woman of shameless morals, each of them the mistress of Marshal de Saxe, a subject he considered to be so evil. The Archbishop recommended the immediate excommunication of both Sarah Bernhardt and Eugene Scribe. Legouve, the second co-author, seems to have been let off the indictment. As Scribe had already been dead some 20 years, to excommunicate him would have offered complications. The Montreal premiere was spectacular. The evening, as was to be expected, opened with the Marseillaise, but this time not routinely sawed and tooted out on the strings and wind instruments of a theater orchestra. Instead, it burst spontaneously and a cappella from the young throats of over 200 French-Canadian students, jamming the top gallery, who suddenly remembered that their sweet old city and picturesque province had first belonged to France, and that they were the sons of Brittany and Normandy. That night, at least, they were all dedicated patriots of the original mother country. Her Majesty's representative, Governor of the province of Quebec, the Marquis of Lorne, son-in-law of Victoria, conspicuous in an official box, stood uneasily at polite attention during the rendering of France's stirring anthem, at the finish of which he signaled the orchestra leader, who dutifully obliged with a stately, proper, and sternly reminding playing of God Save the Queen. The play went on. The star's first entrance and every subsequent appearance was met with shouts and thunderous applause. As she took her final curtain calls, she was all but knocked flat by the bouquets hurled by the audience, while from the gallery the students released a number of white doves to whose necks were loosely attached sonnets and love poems, which were supposed to flutter down at Sarah's feet as the gentle birds circled gracefully over her head. It was a pretty idea which hardly worked out. The doves, terrified by the lights and the noise, circled wildly, not over Sarah's head, but over those of the audience, and what came down was not a collection of love poems, and it did not flutter so much as plop. For all the unfortunate behavior of the doves, nobody objected unless possibly one or two victims of the plops. The house continued wild with enthusiasm. People shouted in French, calling for Notre Sarah. That night and after every subsequent performance of the Montreal engagement, students waited in the bitter cold outside the stage door to carry La Divine on their shoulders to her waiting sleigh, from which they'd unharness the horses and, lining up in the shafts, run her back up the hill to the Windsor Hotel. Doubtless the horses and the coachman were grateful for the relief. Montreal aroused in Sarah Bernhardt the sense of adventure. Setting aside her habitual abhorrence for fresh air, she took daily sleigh rides, glorying in the severe, sparkling cold. There was always an overheated hotel suite or her tropically temperatured dressing room to return to. She dismayed her ever-present retinue and astonished by onlookers by suddenly giving way to crazy impulses. One sharply clear afternoon, while going at a fast clip past a bank of fresh snow, she jumped from the sleigh, flung herself backward into a drift, and, waving her arms up and down at their sides, created one of those imprints which children call making an angel. Another time she frightened the daylights out of Jarrett by again jumping from her sleigh and, calling to her sister Jean to follow her, ran down a slope to the river, where the two of them played a hair-raising game of leaping from ice floe to ice floe on the semi-frozen surface of the St. Lawrence. Jarrett standing on the shore yelling for them to come back instantly. When after quite a few moments they finally did, the ferocious gentleman was livid with rage. Sarah, flushed from her hazardous exertions, merely laughed and called him the current equivalent of a stuffed shirt. Jarrett, still livid, reminded her that he had staked his entire fortune on her and the success of the tour, that thus far he had recouped only 10% of the outlay, and that her silly actions might have resulted not just in her demise, but in his loss of the remainder of his finances. It was a sobering thought, and one which Jarrett knew would appeal to Sarah's business sense. She patted his cold cheek and promised in future to be good. That Sarah had brought Jean along on the tour was an example of the actress's obstinate family loyalty, due perhaps to her Jewish heritage. It was unfortunate that Jean Bernhardt went along on this first United States tour. Actually, she didn't start out with the company, being ill at the time of their departure. She was left behind in Paris with the understanding that after her recovery she would take a later ship and join up with the troupe in New York or Boston. Meanwhile, Sarah engaged an actress named Marie Colombier to play the feminine roles second in importance to her own. Marie Colombier was an attractive wench of scanty talent and much scantier virtue, whose chief claim to fame is that Manet painted a deliciously saucy portrait of her. Marie had been a casual friend of Sarah's ever since their contemporary days at the Conservatoire. She was a gay and vivacious creature with biting wit and a wicked tongue, and Sarah found her amusing. As far as Mademoiselle Colombier's acting was concerned, Madame could afford to be indulgent, knowing the young woman could never steal a scene from her. It was one of the great artist's weaknesses that her magnificent sense of showmanship was focused chiefly upon herself. She was the high-handed exception to the intelligent actor-manager's rule that the ultimate value of a play depends upon the excellence of each and every member of its cast. This actress-manager knew that almost any adequately constructed play in which she had her particular Bernhardt specialty type of part would be a sellout in spite of the possible mediocrity of the other performers. Furthermore, it was Madame's pleasure that they remain mediocre. What professional jealousy she had was reserved for the second-rate actress who started to show alarming signs of becoming first-rate. For the artist who had already achieved greatness, she felt not that slightest rivalry. When she co-starred with Maunay Sully, and the Coqueline, and later with Lucien Guitry, It was with a joyous sense of mutual stimulation. But then, to be sure, they were men whose great virility went to emphasize her feline femininity. Her attitude toward the contemporary leading actresses was affability itself. She dearly loved the delicious comedienne Gabrielle Regine, adored Ellen Terry, and expressed her esteem for Mrs. Patrick Campbell by playing Pelleas to Mrs. Pat's Melisande in what must have been a rather curious performance of Maeterlinck's Moonstruck drama. She professed nothing but worshipful admiration for Eleonora Duse, although in later years, after Italy's exquisite tragedian had fallen upon hard times, hearing her name mentioned one day, Sarah, in childlike innocence, asked, "Whatever became of that old lady?" Duse was 15 years younger than she. When Madame Bernhardt engaged Mademoiselle Colombière, she probably had every intention of having her play the specified supporting leads. In fact, when Marie questioned her about the possibilities of Jean's returning to the cast, Sarah, in tones solemnly reproachful, swore on her sacred word of honor that no actress but Marie Colombier would be entrusted with such significant roles. She sounded convincing, and Colombier told as much to an admirer who had come to see her off on the boat train at the Gare Saint Lazare. The gentleman snorted, "Her sacred word of honor. I wouldn't trust it as far as the Asnieres." Sarah's sacred word of honor went according to her own code, which even she, in one of her flashes of disarming honesty, might have been the first to admit was as subject to change as her moods. One of its rules was that devotion to family came before obligations to employees or friends, and when Jean Bernhardt stepped off the ship in New York, Sarah, by way of sisterly welcome, informed her she was to play 3 of the second roles and conveniently forgot all about all previous commitments to Colombier. Marie Colombier didn't forget, nor did she ever forgive. However, she disguised her sense of outrage behind a carefree manner of bright good humor and bided her time. What's more, she put that time to good account. Back in Paris, after agreeing to go on the Bernhardt tour, she had made a further little agreement on her own with the newspaper L'Événement to write and mail in every few weeks a series of humorous articles reporting the highlights of Madame Sarah's invasion of America. Colombier had a pen as sharp as her tongue, and when her maliciously exaggerated yet highly amusing pieces began to appear in the racy pages of the Événements, they fanned the resentment that was smoldering amid the French public against their national actress. That Monstre Bien Aimé had resented her departure from the Comédie Française, had resented her whirlwind tour of Europe and England, probably because it had been so successful, and now resented her wasting French acting and drama on the desert air of a country Baudelaire had dismissed as a land of barbarians illuminated by gas. The next stop after Montreal was Philadelphia, which city of brotherly love the Bernhardt found dull in the extreme. The one interruption to the tedium was a highly successful exhibition of her sculpture which Jarrett and Abby arranged, again in the mausoleum-like confines of a Union League club. If her theater managers may have lacked a sensitive approach to the plastic arts, they had an unerring sense of the proper setting for their star's mortuary type of statuary. A number of marbles were purchased. This flattered the sculptors and brought a certain amount of relief to the stage crew in charge of baggage, whose duty it had been to haul along such marmoreal overweight in the scenery carts. The first stop after Philadelphia was Chicago. Jarrett had written the mayor in advance asking for a bodyguard of extra police to be on hand in the station, a request the mayor, who had never heard of the Bernhardt, considered absurd. He heard plenty later when he was told that, upon arrival, the lady was all but annihilated by mobs of hysterical greeters, separated from her protecting retinue, and eventually rescued by an unknown ruffian who lifted her up on his shoulders, bore her safely to a cab, and deposited her at the Palmer House. According to her own story as told to Liziane, the fellow was a penitentiary escapee wanted for the murder of his sweetheart, and this knight-errant act in saving Sarah from the crowd resulted in his recapture by the police. She went on to tell Lizzie Ann that some days later she made a special journey out to the Joliet Penitentiary to perform before the prisoners and to exchange a few words of gratitude and compassion with her rescuer, who, the warden informed her, was to be hanged the following morning, the thought of which so unnerved her she could barely stagger through her performances for 3 nights running.